I'm Biresh Banerjee. Welcome to DW News Asia. Glad you could join us. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi has addressed thousands of members of the diaspora at an event in Sydney. Modi is on an official visit to Australia. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese was by Modi's side as the latter attended an event hosted by an Indian diaspora group. The event, called Australia Welcomes Modi, follows a similar pattern of the Indian leader addressing the diaspora during foreign visits. And here's a bit of what he said to an eager and enthusiastic crowd.
मैं जब 2014 में आया था
I made a promise to you all when I came to Australia in 2014
कि आपको
that you will not have to wait for any Indian Prime Minister for 28 years. So here now in Sydney, I have come back again.
And joining me now for more context is Dr. Teesta Prakash from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute in Canberra. Dr. Prakash, Narendra Modi is visiting Australia, but how do events like today's contribute to ties between the two countries?
They highlight the growing sort of people-to-people links between the two countries, and especially in Australia, the Indian diaspora is now the largest growing diaspora group. It's almost close to 1 million, which is a sizable part of the Australian population. Sort of the rock star welcome that Prime Minister Modi has received is largely reflective of the fact that there is now a very, very massive Indian presence. That has, the migration has also increased in the early sort of 2010s, the late 2010s. So the migration pattern is quite young. So they're still very connected to their motherland, as it were. So there's a very strong sort of impetus in the people-to-people links, but also there's a growing defense and economic and security and strategic, essentially, relationship between the country that has really sort of developed in the last 5 years almost.
But is it more than just people-to-people links? Because do events like these, for instance, also help Narendra Modi among the electorate back home?
Absolutely, because Narendra Modi's foreign policy has been largely produced for a domestic audience. As Narendra Modi heads into the election years of 2024, there is a strong need for him to show that he's very popular in the international front. And, the event in Sydney highlights how, he needs to show his sort of growing popularity and really how he's put India on the map, essentially. And really, I think the focus is very much on also harnessing the sort of the skills, the funds, and the influence that harnessing a diaspora that such as the ones in India, the ones in Australia, it really helps him sort of push his campaign out.
Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese is also at this event. Is he, in fact, also endorsing Prime Minister Modi?
I think not so much endorsing, but really sort of, it's a two-level game, right? So on one level, it's an international game that, as you know, the Quad Summit that was supposed to be held in Sydney got cancelled because Biden couldn't make it. So, Modi was the last man standing, essentially, of the people who came in to support him. So it's a way of, Albanese to show that, the Indian Australia really formed the thrust of the Quad, as it were, and really sort of, to solidify the Australia-India relations. But I think on a domestic level, Albanese is also trying to woo the Indian diaspora. As you know, that they are a big part of the Australian population, so they make a sizable voting bloc. So I think there's a two sort of international and domestic level strategic involvement of Prime Minister Albanese here as well.
You spoke about the Quad meeting and the Quad meeting that was cancelled because President Biden did not show up, could not make it. And the Quad has been criticized for being essentially an anti-China grouping. Speaking of India-Australia ties, is it fair to say that a combined weariness of China is driving bilateral ties?
It's one of the factors. It's not the only factor. I think it must also be mentioned that India is now the fastest growing economy within the G20 economies, right? When Narendra Modi first came to Australia, which was as his prime minister, it was 2014, when he had just sort of, come into power, and he was not that sort of comfortable on the world stage. But 9 years later, India has changed its position. It's such a strong economy, and the fact that Australia and India are now trying to really solidify their full free trade agreement, there's that sort of economic aspect of it. But yes, underlying it all, there is the strategic element of a rising China in the neighborhood, and what that means to balance it, and how sort of Australia and India are sort of coming together to arrange that sort of a balance of power in the region, as it were.
How much of a concern is a criticism that Narendra Modi's government hasn't been, let's say, kind to minorities and critics in India? Does that figure at all in the bilateral ties between both countries?
Very much so, but I think given how hard it's been to get the Australia-India relationship going once more, the Australian side at least has realized that, calling out India publicly doesn't really do much. In fact, it curtails from the relationship. So a lot of these criticisms and complaints are done interpersonal and sort of, behind closed doors. The diaspora in Australia is also quite rich and multicultural, right? It's not just Hindus who are coming. There's Sikhs, there's Muslims, there's Christians. So the politics travels with them. There has been sort of protest against Prime Minister Modi when he's visiting here. So that has to be taken in the context of really sort of the nuance with which Prime Minister Modi is seen in Australia.
We'll leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Teesta Prakash.
Thank you so much.